The October sunlight over Manhattan was not a caress, it was a calibration. It struck the steel and glass canyons of Midtown with a terrifying precision, carving the city into absolute zones of blinding white light and profound, freezing shadow. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and unsentimental, the kind of day that demanded efficiency from the millions of souls rushing through the grid. In the middle of this concrete machine, on a corner that real estate developers had been trying to buy for a decade, stood a small shop called the Conservatory. The windows were not gleaming sheets of seamless glass like the skyscrapers surrounding them. They were old, slightly warped, and framed in painted wood that was peeling just enough to show the age beneath. Inside, the air did not smell of ozone and money. It smelled of damp earth, crushed stems, eucalyptus, and the sweet, heavy rot of dying lilies. Maisie stood behind the counter, her hands submerged in a bucket of ice-cold water. At 26, Maisie was a woman who existed in the periphery. She was the florist who arranged the bouquets for the galas she was never invited to attend. She was the artist who crafted the centerpieces for weddings where she would never catch the bouquet. She wore an oversized knit sweater the color of oatmeal and a canvas apron stained with chlorophyll and pollen. Her hair, a dark, unruly tangle, was pinned back with a pencil, revealing a face that was striking not for its glamour, but for its stillness. She pulled a stem of hydrangea from the water, inspecting the petals with a surgeon's focus. She cut the stem at a 45-degree angle, a sharp, decisive snip that echoed in the quiet shop. We build monuments to outlast us, forgetting that the most beautiful things are the ones designed to fade. Outside the window, the city moved at a blur. Men in charcoal suits marched toward the financial district, phones pressed to their ears, eyes fixed on the horizon of the next quarter's earnings. Maisie watched them sometimes. She wondered what it felt like to live in a world measured in stock prices and steel beams, rather than in bloom cycles and wilt. One man in particular caught her eye. He walked past her shop every morning at 7:15 a.m. He never looked inside. He walked with a stride that suggested he owned the pavement beneath his feet. Silas Hawthorne. Maisie knew his name not because they had met, but because his name was chiseled into the cornerstone of the Hawthorne Tower, the 70-story glass needle that cast a shadow over her shop every afternoon. He was 35, an architect of global renown, a man obsessed with permanence. He built structures designed to withstand hurricanes, earthquakes, and time itself. He was handsome in a severe, classical way, sharp jaw, dark eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that rarely smiled because smiling was an inefficiency. Today, however, Silas did not walk past. The bell above the shop door chimed, a bright, brassy sound that shattered the morning quiet. Maisie froze, a bundle of white roses in her hand. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of wind and the noise of traffic. Silas Hawthorne stepped inside. He seemed to fill the small space instantly. He was taller than he looked through the window, and his presence was heavy, like a stone dropped into a still pond. He wore a navy coat tailored to within an inch of its life, and he held leather gloves in one hand. He looked out of place among the buckets of wildflowers and the hanging ivy. He looked like a statue that had wandered into a jungle. He didn't say hello. He looked around the shop with a critical, appraising eye, scanning the flowers as if he were inspecting the structural integrity of a load-bearing wall. "I need an arrangement," Silas said. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely transactional. "For this evening." Maisie wiped her wet hands on her apron, her heart performing a nervous flutter against her ribs. She stepped out from behind the counter. "Of course," she said softly. "What is the occasion?" "An engagement party," Silas replied. He didn't say my engagement party, but the stiffness in his shoulders said it for him. "It needs to be impressive, architectural, clean lines, no clutter." He pointed a gloved hand toward the bucket of stiff, long-stemmed white roses she had been processing. 3 dozen of those, in a cylinder vase. No filler. No greens. Just the structure. It was a cold order. It was a request for a flower arrangement that looked as little like nature as possible. Maisie looked at the roses. They were perfect, uniform, and utterly boring. They were safe. They were exactly what a man like Silas Hawthorne would choose, something that looked good in a photograph but held no scent, no memory. "I can do that," Maisie said, her voice gaining a quiet strength. She picked up a rose, spinning it between her fingers. "But white roses bruise easily, Mr. Hawthorne. If you want something that speaks of endurance, you shouldn't choose something so fragile." Silas stopped. He turned his gaze from the flowers to her face. It was the first time he had truly looked at her. He saw the smudge of soil on her cheek. He saw the rough, red skin of her hands, chapped from the water. He saw the way she held the flower, not as a commodity, but as a living thing. "You know who I am," he stated. "Everyone knows the man who blocks out the sun," Maisie replied, gesturing vaguely toward his tower across the street. Silas blinked. It was a rare reaction. He was used to deference, not poetic critique. He stepped closer to the counter, invading her personal space with the scent of sandalwood and cold air. "And what would you suggest if not the roses?" he asked, a challenge in his tone. "Weeds. Hellebores," Maisie said. She walked to a bucket in the shadows and pulled out a stem. The flower was complex, a moody mix of dusty purple and green, nodding its head downward. They bloom in the frost. They survive when everything else dies. They aren't perfect, but they are real. She held the flower out to him. Silas looked at the hellebore. It was chaotic. It was asymmetrical. It was everything he usually edited out of his blueprints. But as he looked at the flower, and then at the woman holding it, he felt a strange, unfamiliar crack in his composure. He was a man who planned cities for a living, yet he had never accounted for the disruption of a woman with dirt under her fingernails offering him a flower that looked like a bruise. "Fine," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Use them, but have them delivered by 5 p.m. The guests arrive at 6 o'clock. They will be there," Maisie promised. Silas turned to leave. He reached for the door handle, then paused. He didn't look back, but he hesitated, as if the air inside the shop was heavier than the air outside, making it hard to move. Then the discipline kicked in. He opened the door and stepped back into the blinding light of the city, leaving Maisie alone in the sudden silence, holding the purple flower like a secret he had refused to take, but couldn't quite leave behind. The weeks that followed the engagement party did not bring the distance that social stratification usually demanded. Instead, they brought a rhythm. It was a hesitant, uneven cadence, like a heartbeat skipping, but it was there. Silas Hawthorne returned to the conservatory. He didn't come for grand arrangements. He didn't order centerpieces for galas. He came in the quiet, hollow hours of the late afternoon, when the winter sun was dragging long, gray shadows across the floorboards. He told himself it was efficiency. The shop was on his route home, the air quality in his penthouse was too dry, the lobby of the Hawthorne Tower needed organic softening. But these were lies told by a man who prided himself on truth. He came because the air in the shop was the only air in Manhattan that didn't demand anything from him. It was a Tuesday, late November. The city was bracing for the first snow, the sky a heavy sheet of slate. Inside, the shop was warm and humid, smelling of damp moss and spicy carnations. Maisie was repotting a massive fiddle-leaf fig in the corner, her arms coated in dark, rich soil up to the elbows. She heard the bell chime. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The heavy, confident footsteps were as familiar to her now as the drip of the faucet in the back sink. "You're wearing the gray suit today," Maisie said, her voice muffled slightly as she packed dirt around the roots. "It matches the sky. It makes you look invisible." "Invisibility is a tactical advantage," Silas replied. He closed the door, shutting out the sirens and the jackhammers. He walked to the counter, taking off his leather gloves. He placed them next to a delicate vase of orchids with a care that suggested they were made of glass. He watched her work. He watched the way her muscles tensed as she lifted the heavy pot. He watched the dirt smear against her skin, a stark contrast to the sanitized, hermetically sealed world he inhabited 40 stories up. "You are making a mess," Silas observed, but there was no judgment in his tone. There was envy. "Growth is messy, Silas," Maisie countered, wiping a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of earth on her pale temple. "You can't build a life without getting your hands dirty. You architects, you draw lines on paper and think you've controlled the world. But the roots don't care about your blueprints. They go where they need to go." Silas walked around the counter. It was a violation of the unspoken boundary between merchant and customer, but neither of them moved to stop it. He stood near her, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the soil and the faint, sweet scent of vanilla she wore. "My blueprints stand for 100 years, Silas said softly. "This tree, it could die tomorrow." "Yes," Maisie agreed, looking up at him. "It could. That's why it's beautiful. Because it's risking something just by being here. We surround ourselves with stone and steel to feel safe, forgetting that the only things that truly touch us are the things that can bleed." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. It wasn't an empty silence. It was filled with the unsaid things that were growing in the dark corners of the room. Silas looked at her hands, dirty, rough, capable. He looked at his own hands, manicured, clean, empty. Without thinking, he reached out. He didn't touch her skin. He reached for a towel hanging on the rack beside her. He dipped it into the bucket of warm water she kept for the tropicals. "Let me," he whispered. Maisie froze. She stood paralyzed as one of the most powerful men in the city took her hand. He wiped the soil from her fingers with a tenderness that was devastating. The rough terrain of the towel against her skin, the heat of his hand through the fabric, the absolute focus in his eyes. It was more intimate than a kiss. It was an act of service from a man who was used to being served. "You have a scar here," Silas murmured, tracing a faint white line on her palm with his thumb. "Rose thorn," Maisie breathed, her voice barely audible. "From years ago." "It healed well," he said. He didn't let go of her hand. He held it, suspended in the space between their two worlds. For a moment, the tower across the street didn't exist. The engagement didn't exist. There was only the florist and the architect, standing in the debris of creation, recognizing the loneliness in each other. "Silas," Maisie whispered, a warning and a plea wrapped together. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he admitted. His thumb brushed the pulse point of her wrist. It was racing. "But I don't know how to leave." The bell above the door chimed aggressively. The sound shattered the moment like a hammer hitting glass. Silas dropped her hand instantly, stepping back, his posture snapping into the rigid, armored stance of the public figure. The door flew open. A woman walked in. She was blonde, sleek, and dressed in a white cashmere coat that looked like it had never touched a subway railing. She carried a designer bag like a weapon, and wore a diamond on her left hand that caught the shop lights and threw them back with a cold, hard glare. Camilla Vance, the fiancée. She looked around the cluttered, humid shop with a mixture of confusion and distaste. Her eyes landed on Silas, then flickered to Maisie, taking in the apron, the dirt, the palpable tension in the air. "Silas?" Camilla asked, her voice sharp and perfectly modulated. "My driver said he saw you come in here." Again, Silas adjusted his cuffs. The mask was back in place, but Maisie saw the strain behind his eyes. "I was discussing the floral arrangements for the lobby." "Camilla," Silas lied. His voice was cool, detached. "The ficus trees are dying. I needed a consultation." Camilla walked toward the counter. She didn't look at Maisie's face. She looked at her dirty hands. She looked at the towel Silas had just discarded. Really? Camilla smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You have a team of interior designers for that, darling. Why are you consulting a girl who looks like she just crawled out of a compost heap? She reached out and linked her arm through Silas's, reclaiming her property. She pulled him slightly, reasserting the gravity of their shared orbit. Come along, Camilla commanded gently, turning her back on Maisie. We're late for the tasting menu. And this place, it smells like decay. Silas let himself be led away. He didn't look back at Maisie. He walked out into the gray evening, into the world of white cashmere and steel, leaving Maisie standing alone with her clean hand burning where he had touched it, realizing that the walls between them were not just made of glass. They were made of diamonds, and they were impenetrable. December descended upon New York City not as a season, but as a sentence. The wind off the Hudson River turned into a knife, stripping the last of the autumn warmth from the streets and encasing the city in a shell of gray ice. The Hawthorne Tower stood in the center of the frieze, a 70-story monolith of tempered glass and ambition. Tonight was the Winter Solstice Gala, the official unveiling of the building's atrium, a soaring, cathedral-like space designed to intimidate the gods. Maisie was there, but she was not a guest. She was kneeling on the cold marble floor of the atrium, surrounded by crates of winter jasmine, white amaryllis, and the hellebores Silas had once grudgingly admired. She had been commissioned, through an assistant's assistant, to create a living installation for the center of the room. It was a massive job, one that would pay her rent for 6 months, but it felt like accepting money to decorate her own execution. She worked in silence, weaving the dark, twisting branches of willow into a structure that defied the rigid geometry of the room. She was creating a storm of frozen blooms in the middle of Silas's perfect, sterile box. We pour our love into spaces that will never hold us, leaving pieces of our soul in rooms where we are not allowed to sit. It looks like a fracture. The voice came from the shadows of the mezzanine stairs. Maisie didn't jump. Her body knew the frequency of that voice. She stood up, brushing the pine needles from her black work trousers. Silas walked into the light. He was wearing a tuxedo, the black tie undone, hanging loose around his neck. He looked exhausted. The circles under his eyes were dark bruises against his pale skin. He didn't look like the triumphant architect on the eve of his greatest victory. He looked like a man who had been holding up the ceiling with his bare hands for too long. "A fracture?" Maisie asked, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "In the perfection," Silas clarified. He stopped a few feet away from her, respecting the invisible electric fence that social convention had erected between them. "The building is all math, all logic, and you brought chaos." "Life is chaos, Silas," she replied softly. "If you try to curate it too much, you just end up with a mausoleum." Silas flinched. The word hit a target she hadn't meant to aim for. He looked around the empty atrium, at the cold glass, the expensive stone, the hollow echo of his own footsteps. "I built this to last forever," he whispered. "But standing here tonight, it feels like a cage." He stepped closer. The magnetic pull that had started in the flower shop was stronger now, amplified by the vacuum of the empty tower. He reached out, his hand hovering near the arrangement, near her hand. "Maisie," he said, her name sounding foreign and desperate on his tongue. "I don't want to go up there tonight. I don't want the speeches. I don't want the applause. I just want to stand here in the dirt with you." For a moment, the world stopped. The gala, the fiancé, the legacy, it all suspended in the air like breath in the cold. Maisie looked at him, and she saw the boy beneath the architect, the human beneath the monument. She took a step forward. Then, the sound of heels clicking on marble shattered the silence. It was a sharp, rhythmic staccato. Camilla Vance emerged from the private elevator. She was dressed in a gown of silver sequins that looked like armor. She didn't look angry. She looked amused. "How touching," Camilla drawled, her voice echoing off the glass walls. The architect and the gardener. It's almost Shakespearean. Or is it just a cliché? Silas straightened up instantly, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of stone. Camilla! We were discussing the installation. Stop it, Silas, Camilla said, walking over to the floral display. She reached out and snapped the head off a white amaryllis with a casual, terrifying violence. You aren't discussing anything. You are indulging in a fantasy. And frankly, it's becoming a liability. She turned her cold, blue gaze to Maisie. You think he sees you, Camilla said to Maisie, her tone conversational, almost kind. You think because he buys a few weeds from your sad little shop that he understands you. But Silas doesn't understand organic things, my dear. He understands ownership. He understands assets. I am not an asset, Maisie said, her voice shaking but her chin high. No, Camilla agreed. You're a risk. And Silas hates risks. Camilla pulled a folded document from her clutch. She didn't hand it to Silas. She placed it on the marble ledge of the planter, right next to Maisie's dirt-stained shears. The zoning committee is reviewing the expansion for 5th and Main, Camilla said lightly. The corner where your little shop sits. It seems the city needs a new turn lane. Eminent domain. Maisie went cold. Her shop was everything. It was her mother's legacy. It was her life. Silas looked at the document, then at Camilla. His face went pale. He knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a possibility. It was a threat. Camilla's father sat on the zoning board. She could erase Maisie's world with a single phone call. Camilla, Silas warned, his voice low. Don't. Then fix it, Camilla hissed, her mask slipping just enough to show the shark beneath. Send her away, Silas. Permanently. The committee votes on the seizure Monday morning. My father controls the quorum. Make her disappear, or by 9 a.m. Monday, her legacy belongs to the city. Silas looked at Maisie. He saw the terror in her eyes. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that he could not protect her and keep her at the same time. He was a powerful man, but in this arena, the arena of old money and ruthless connections, he was outmatched. To save her sanctuary, he had to destroy her hope. He turned to Maisie. His eyes died. The light left them, replaced by the flat, reflective surface of the glass he loved so much. Camilla is right, Silas said. His voice was unrecognizable, robotic, devoid of blood. Maisie stepped back, as if he had struck her. Silas, this arrangement is inadequate, Silas said, gesturing to the flowers she had poured her soul into. It doesn't fit the aesthetic of the tower. It's too messy. Too common. Silas, please, Maisie whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Pack your things, miss. He paused, pretending to forget her name. Miss Maisie, you are dismissed. We will find a vendor who understands the grandeur of this project. You don't mean that, she choked out. I mean exactly that, Silas lied, and the lie cut his own throat as he spoke it. I need perfection tonight, and you are simply a distraction. He turned his back on her. He faced the elevator, staring at his own reflection in the polished steel doors, so he wouldn't have to watch her break. Maisie stood there for a heartbeat, the sound of his rejection echoing in the vast, cold atrium. She looked at the man she had thought was a kindred spirit and saw only a statue. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply picked up her shears. She gathered her crates. She walked past Camilla, who was smiling like a cat that had just eaten the canary, and walked out of the revolving doors into the freezing night. Silas listened to her footsteps fade. He listened to the silence return. And then he looked down at his hands, realizing that in his desperate attempt to preserve the structure, he had just demolished the only thing inside it that was actually alive. The applause in the atrium of the Hawthorne Tower was deafening. It was a thunderous, rhythmic wave of approval from the city's elite, washing over the man standing at the podium. Silas Hawthorne held a crystal flute of vintage champagne. He wore the mask of the stoic genius, the architect who had tamed the skyline. Beside him, Camilla beamed, her hand resting possessively on his arm, a diamond-encrusted shackle. But Silas couldn't hear the applause. All he could hear was the echo of Maisie's footsteps walking away from him. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the mayor. He saw the zoning board members. He saw the envy in the eyes of his rivals. And then he looked at the centerpieces. They were massive, perfectly spherical arrangements of white hydrangeas, cold, odorless, and structurally sound. They were exactly what he had asked for. They were dead. A sudden, violent nausea gripped him. The air in the atrium, filtered in climate control to a perfect 70 degrees, felt thin. He looked at the glass walls he had designed to be invisible, and suddenly he saw them for what they were, barriers. He had spent his life building walls to keep the chaos out, only to realize he had locked himself in with the cold. We build monuments to outlast us, forgetting that a legacy without love is just a very expensive tomb. Silas set his glass down on the podium. The crystal made a sharp clink that the microphone picked up, amplifying it into a gunshot. "Silas!" Camilla whispered, her smile faltering. "The toast. You haven't made the toast." Silas looked at her. He saw the calculation in her eyes. He saw the woman who would bulldoze a flower shop to secure a marriage. "No," Silas said into the microphone. It wasn't part of a speech. The room went silent. "I built this tower to be a symbol of endurance," Silas said, his voice echoing off the marble. "But I realize tonight that I don't know anything about endurance. I only know about preservation. And they are not the same thing." He stepped back from the podium. He didn't look at the mayor. He didn't look at the press. He turned and walked off the stage, leaving the microphone humming with feedback and Camilla standing alone in the spotlight, her mouth open in a silent scream of social horror. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs. He ran down 40 flights, stripping off his tuxedo jacket as he went, tearing the bow tie from his throat as if it were a noose. He burst out of the service entrance and into the freezing night. He didn't call his driver. He ran. He ran 3 blocks against the biting wind, his dress shoes slipping on the icy pavement, his breath tearing at his lungs. He reached the corner of 5th and Main. The conservatory was dark. The closed sign was flipped in the window. But there was a faint light in the back room, a single bulb burning against the encroaching shadows. Silas pounded on the door. The glass rattled in the old wood frame. "Maisie!" he shouted. "Open the door!" Inside, Maisie dropped the shears she had been using to cut back the dead stems of the winter stock. She froze. She knew that voice. But it wasn't the voice of the composed architect. It was the voice of a man unraveling. She walked to the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She unlocked it, not because she wanted to, but because she was afraid he would break the glass if she didn't. She swung the door open. Silas stood there, chest heaving, his white shirt soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His hair was wild. The perfect man was ruined. "Get out," Maisie said, her voice shaking with the effort to be strong. "You made your point, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm inadequate. I'm a distraction. Go back to your tower." "I lied," Silas gasped, stepping into the shop, bringing the cold wind with him. "I lied about everything." "It didn't sound like a lie," Maisie snapped, backing away behind the counter, putting the barrier of flowers between them. "It sounded like you were ashamed of me." "I was ashamed," Silas yelled, the confession tearing out of him. "I was ashamed that I couldn't protect you any other way." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't a check. It was a copy of the Zoning Commission's agenda for the next morning. He slammed it onto the counter, right next to a vase of wilting lilies. "Look at it, Maisie. Item 4. Eminent domain seizure of property 402B for roadway expansion. That's this shop. Maisie looked down. The words swam before her eyes. Camilla, Silas said, his voice dropping to a tortured whisper. She told me in the atrium. The zoning vote is tomorrow morning. It's rigged, Maisie. If I didn't fire you, if I didn't make you leave, she was going to signal her father to approve the seizure. You would have lost the deed before you even opened the shop on Monday. She was going to take your mother's legacy and turn it into asphalt. Maisie looked up at him. The anger in her chest began to fracture, replaced by a confused, aching dawn of realization. You fired me to save the shop, she whispered. I fired you to save your roots, Silas corrected. He leaned over the counter, his eyes burning with intensity. I knew that if I broke your heart, you would leave. And if you left, she would lose interest. The shop would be safe. I destroyed us to keep your world standing. You idiot, Maisie cried, a tear escaping and tracking through the dirt on her cheek. You think you can just design people's lives like you design a lobby? You don't get to make that choice for me, Silas. You don't get to decide what I lose. I couldn't watch them take this from you, Silas pleaded. I know what it's like to lose a home. I built a 70-story tower just to prove I could never be evicted again. I couldn't let them do it to you. So you evicted yourself from my life instead? Maisie challenged. Yes, Silas said, because I thought I could survive it. I thought I could go back to the tower and be the man of stone again. He walked around the counter. He stopped inches from her. He smelled of cold air and expensive champagne in desperation. But I was wrong, he whispered. I stood on that stage tonight, and I looked at the city, and all I saw was gray. You were the only color I had, Maisie, and I painted over you. He reached out, his hand trembling. He didn't touch her face. He reached for her hand, the one with the rose thorn scar. I left the gala, he said. I left Camilla. I left the mayor. I walked out on the biggest night of my life because none of it matters if I can't come here on a Tuesday and watch you repot a fern. Maisie looked at him. She saw the ruins of his composure. She saw the sacrifice he had made, clumsy, arrogant, but deeply, terrifyingly loving. He had played the villain to be her shield. You left the gala, she asked, her voice barely audible. I resigned from the performance, Silas answered. I'm done building walls, Maisie. I want to build a door, but you have to be the one to open it. He waited. The silence in the shop was heavy, smelling of damp earth and hope. Maisie looked at the zoning paper on the counter, then at the man standing before her. He had saved her shop, but he had broken her trust. The foundation was cracked. But as any good architect knew, a crack wasn't the end of a structure. It was just the place where the light got in. She didn't pull her hand away. You have a lot of work to do, Mr. Hawthorne, she whispered, her fingers curling slightly around his. Structural repairs take time. I have time, Silas vowed, closing his eyes as he felt the warmth of her hand anchor him to the earth. I have the rest of my life. The bell above the door was silent now, but the air between them was humming. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small, cluttered shop, the first fragile stem of forgiveness was beginning to push through the frost. The scandal that followed the Winter Solstice Gala was, by New York standards, a supernova. It burned bright, hot, and destructive for exactly 3 days. The tabloids ran headlines about the meltdown of the architect and the broken engagement of the year. Camilla Vance gave a tearful, exclusive interview where she described Silas as unstable and overworked. The zoning board, sensing the shift in wind and fearing a public relations nightmare, quietly dropped the eminent domain case against the corner of 5th and Main. Silas Hawthorne didn't read the articles. He didn't watch the interview. For the first time in his adult life, he was unreachable. His phone lay off the hook in his penthouse. His email auto-reply was a single, curt sentence stating he was on sabbatical. He was not in the Hamptons. He was not in Europe. He was in the back room of the conservatory, sitting on a milk crate, learning how to deadhorn roses without drawing blood. It was a slow, painful re-education. Silas was a man used to commanding steel to bend. Now, he was learning to listen to the whisper of a stem. He watched Maisie work. He saw how she moved with the seasons, accepting the death of a bloom as part of the beauty, not a structural failure. Winter softened into a wet, gray spring. The city shook off the ice, and the rhythm of the shop returned. But the dynamic had shifted. Silas was no longer the customer watching from the other side of the glass. He was part of the ecosystem. He still wore suits. Old habits died hard, but the ties were gone, and there was often a smudge of potting soil on his cuffs. He brought his drafting table into the shop, setting it up in the corner where the light was best. He began to draw again, but the lines were different. They were less rigid. They curved. They breathed. One rainy afternoon in April, Maisie found him staring at a blueprint of the Hawthorne Tower, the very building that had almost separated them. He had a red pen in his hand, and he was slashing through the design of the atrium. "You're ruining it," Maisie said softly, placing a mug of tea on his desk. "I'm fixing it," Silas corrected. He looked up at her, his dark eyes clear and free of the haunted exhaustion that had defined him for years. "I designed a tomb, Maisie. It needs to be a greenhouse. We build monuments to outlast us, forgetting that a legacy without love is just a very expensive tomb." The leitmotif echoed in the quiet shop, but this time it wasn't a lament. It was a blueprint for reconstruction. Silas spent the next 6 months fighting the board of his own firm. He spent his own fortune. He called in favors he had saved for a decade. He stripped the cold, imported marble from the atrium of the Hawthorne Tower. He removed the sterile white sculptures. In their place, he brought in soil. Tons of it. He hired only one consultant for the project. On the 1-year anniversary of the day they met, a crisp, bright October Tuesday, Silas blindfolded Maisie and led her into the revolving doors of the tower. "Silas!" she laughed, her hands gripping his arms. "If this is another white rose arrangement, I'm leaving." "It's not white," he promised. He stopped her in the center of the atrium. He untied the silk blindfold. Maisie blinked against the light. She gasped. The cavernous, echoing hall was gone. In its place was a living forest. Massive weeping willows cascaded from the mezzanine levels. Walls of living moss dampened the sound of footsteps. But in the center, where the sterile podium had once stood, was a sprawling, chaotic, magnificent garden of hellebores, thousands of them, in every shade of purple, green, and dusted pink. It was wild. It was imperfect. It was a riot of life growing in the heart of the machine. "You planted weeds," Maisie whispered, tears filling her eyes as she recognized the flowers he had once rejected. "I planted resilience," Silas corrected. He stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, anchoring her to him. "I realized that the structure doesn't matter if there's no life inside it. This building, it was just a shell. You were the heartbeat. People were walking through the atrium, businessmen, tourists, couriers. But they didn't rush. They slowed down. They looked at the flowers. They breathed. The architecture of intimidation had been replaced by the architecture of connection." Maisie turned in his arms. She looked at the man who had once been a statue, the man who had been terrified of anything that could fade. He had aged in the last year. There were new lines around his eyes, lines from smiling, lines from worry, lines from living. He looked less perfect and infinitely more handsome. "It will die, you know," Maisie warned him gently, gesturing to the garden. "The flowers will wilt. The leaves will fall. It won't last forever." "Good," Silas said. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. "Let it fade. Let it change. I don't want forever anymore, Maisie. I just want right now." He kissed her then, not with the desperation of the winter, but with the steady, deep assurance of the autumn. It was a kiss that tasted of patience and earth. Above them, the glass ceiling he had designed to block out the elements now let the sun stream in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, turning the imperfections into gold. Maisie closed her eyes, leaning into him. She remembered the mornings she had stood in her window, watching him march past, a titan of industry too busy to look down. She remembered the pain of being the observer, the florist on the corner who dealt in fleeting things. But as Silas pulled her closer, surrounded by the garden he had built in her honor, she realized that the roles had reversed. The tower was no longer casting a shadow over her shop. Her shop had grown roots that cracked the tower's foundation and filled it with light. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. He wasn't looking at the skyline. He wasn't looking at his legacy. He was looking at her. She was the florist who had always watched from afar, waiting for a glimpse of the man behind the glass, until the day he shattered the glass to finally see her back.